Good evening, everyone. Time for episode 23 of Kurrs Rage, part 1 of the Duaredheim staff Saga by me. And if you recall, the last episode, the party entered into a vicious fight with a party of red orcs. The chapter is entitled Tarik, Tarik being Tariq Longstride, the character. And Tarik is a rendition of one of my great high school friends, Joseph C. Garside. And he is a character in The Last Admiral. And he appears all throughout Kurrs Rage and the Drums of Doom in the guise of Tariq Longstride. So if you want to know what Tariq looks like, just put some pointy ears on Joe, and there you have it. Okay. So today's episode takes place. This is a map of the Northern Reaches I drew for the books. It's also a rendition of a map I used in my own Dungeons and Dragons campaign. The characters are now north of Nordtown Village. They follow the path of the retreating Red Orc and War Party. And the X that says Cirrus is where the characters are battling the party of Red Orcs right now. Okay. So without ado, we'll start at the bottom of page 240 where we left off last time. The War Master stopped 5 paces from him. He lowered his club so that he could better see his unmoving antagonist. The elf stood a full head shorter than he did and weighed far less than 1/2 of his own weight. He concluded that this elf was either insane or a great fool. But whichever proved to be true, it would be a simple matter to crush him to death with his club. He had little time to spare from his command duties for dealing with this elf, and so he attacked first. Stepping forth with all his strength, he swung his club in a wide, waist-high arc designed to tear the elf in half. By this time, Darton and Leander were only a few yards behind Carmen and her enemy. Advancing toward them were 2 sizable orcs protected by stolen chainmail shirts. Each of them carried swords similar to Leander's scimitar, although theirs looked heavier and less well made. Their round wooden shields were ornamented with a red moon upon a black field. They were followers of the moon, and they wasted no time in attacking. Leander was the first to meet them. Charging out from behind the protective cover of a thick pine trunk, he took the lead orc's first slash upon his shield and thrust with his own weapon. In a moment, the warrior priest of Odin was beside him, fighting in the same Arendish style. They received the orc's blows with their shields and countered with vicious slashes towards any opening in their enemy's defenses. They fought ferociously, and Dartin had no breath to spare in any prayers to the All-Father. The orcs were fighting tooth and nail. In the meantime, Kurr Kegporter, son of Moldrin and Isa, was having the time of his life. Running headlong into the fray, he paid no attention to the occasional bolts that whizzed past him. All his attention was focused on the 2 red orcs moving toward him. Normally he'd use his axe, which was strapped across his back, but he was soon to face a 2-on-1 situation, so he chose the short-hafted hand axe at his belt and his short sword instead. He remembered the orc tales of his grandfather, and he knew that they believed the dwarves to be their most ancient and dangerous foes. With that understanding, he realized why 2 warriors had been dispatched to meet him. He would waste no time in underestimating them, nor would he allow them to organize their attack. Running to meet them, he clashed his weapons together thrice to honor Clangeddon. On this day, he would become a fully bearded dwarf or die. At the southern end of the clearing, Dow was busy searching for an open shot, but few were presenting themselves as the combatants closed with one another. He couldn't leave Kalor unguarded. It was then that he sensed, more than he saw, 2 orcs stalking through the woods to intercept them. It was the same white-haired shaman who had plagued them at Nordtown, the same warlock who had paralyzed many of the city's defenders with his unholy magic. His helpless victims had then been ruthlessly hacked down. Dao knew that the shaman possessed even more gruesome powers that he had no knowledge of, and if he were allowed to call upon those powers, then all hope would be lost. "Kalor," he said, "the orcs have a warlock amongst them. I will try to reach him with my arrows, but we may need your magic." "I think that I have just the thing," Kalor replied. "Just try and give me a few more moments to concentrate." Placing his book of shadows back inside of his pack, he turned, raising his hands before him, beginning his incantation. Windows opened within his mind, his body becoming a conduit for power. His master, Ulrich, had shown him the basics of illusion, not the sleight of hand of common circus magicians, but the actual ability to conjure images. The spell that he'd chosen would allow him to create phantasmal pictures under his control. Perhaps it would be just the diversion that his friends would need. Carmen was trained in many forms of fighting from an early age. At first, her training had come in the form of games taught to her by her father. When she was of age, her training became much more serious. He began by teaching her the basics of hand fighting, the strength found in proper stances, the role of balance, and the virtues of proper timing and concentration. She quickly learned that one of the best methods of overcoming fear during a fight was to expect to be hurt. By doing so, the mind is released from the need to anticipate potential pain and is thus free to act. She knew that strength alone would only prevail against a weaker opponent. Much more was needed to defeat a more physically gifted adversary, and she was certain that this orc was just such an enemy. Fang charged. His strength and speed were amazing for such a massively constructed beast, but he was propelled by rage, and his thoughts were unclear. His mind was filled with lust for blood, and it wouldn't be satisfied until she lay torn to pieces upon the battlefield. Fang's rage was his weakness. It made him predictable, and thus vulnerable, and so she waited, standing frozen in place, as if she was lost in her own fear. Her face was a mask of feigned horror. Her timing would have to be perfect. Fang raised his club to smash her. Kneeling suddenly, she set her halberd to meet his charge. He didn't even have time to contemplate his mistake, as her weapon's 2-foot-long blade crushed through his steel breastplate and exited his back between his shoulder blades. His war club was catapulted from his hands, spinning end over end for several yards before it finally came to rest somewhere in the woods behind her. His blood flowed freely over her blade. Fighting off a moment of self-loathing, she watched him die. She had a sensitive heart, but this was war, and her enemies held no pity for them. Survival required a steel will and a clear conscience. With all her strength, she rolled the orc onto his back, planted her feet on his belly, and retrieved her halberd. Wiping its blade off on his chest, she looked about, searching for another foe. Tariq wasn't surprised by the war master's tactic. Orcs of his ilk had attacked him in similar fashion before, and as the orc swung his club in that great killing stroke, Tariq thought of the badger and threw himself flat upon the ground. Erg's attack passed harmlessly over his head. Nearly unbalanced, Erg quickly recovered from his mistake. He was no ordinary orc, nor was he an inexperienced fighter. He'd fought in as many battles as Tariq had. Through experience, he achieved many victories. He backpedaled, needing time and distance to regain his footing. Rising to his feet, Tariq's counterslash meant nothing but air. He'd faced many orcs wielding these same weapons in the past, but most of them had relied upon their superior strength and heavy clubs to subdue their opponents. He doubted that this orc would act any differently, but he was prepared for anything. This was no ordinary elf. Changing tactics, Erg renewed his attack with a series of spinning swipes. They would protect him from the elf's shorter weapons and allow him to close with a kill. His attack was methodical, relentless, and assured of victory. Tariq concentrated upon Urg's renewed attack, parrying any blows that came too close. He sidestepped and retreated, searching for a pattern in the orc's movements. Yes, he thought, I must act now. He'd found his enemy's rhythm. Stepping inside of Urg's next swing, he cut his wrist with his dagger and his face with his thrusting sword. But in committing to the attack, he was forced to leave himself open. Urg came down with the butt of his club onto his back. The tremendous force of the blow slammed him to the ground. Urg's right hand was limp and lifeless. His wrist tendons had been severed. His face was split open from his chin to the top of his left eye, and his own blood was blinding him. Doubt in his injuries prevented him from immediately renewing his attack. He had to fall back a little and see how hurt the elf was first. Maybe then he could move in and finish him with the considerable strength of his left arm. Tariq's breath exploded from his lungs. It took all his will to focus through the pain. If he were to survive, he would have to move despite the agony. Rolling away, he rose to his feet through sheer will. His desire to see the end of his sworn enemy was greater than his pain. He squeezed his weapon handles tightly to keep from dropping them in his weakness. His world suddenly narrowed, and he nearly swooned. He stood waiting for the right moment to finish his enemy. He just hoped that the proper time wouldn't come before his breath returned. Leander faced a savage orc with but one great tooth. Its second lower canine was merely a broken stump that he'd probably lost in some bestial mating ritual. He dealt many small wounds to the orc and had luckily received none in turn. He was hopeful of victory, because the orc was rapidly weakening from loss of blood. Dartin was fighting beside him, and he'd received a staggering blow to the side of his helm. The impact of the hit was such that it would have caved in any skull of lesser thickness. Seeing double, Dartin's nausea was overwhelming. Realizing his vulnerability, he tried to conceal his weakness by fighting back savagely. But the desperate effort was taxing, and he felt the last of his strength waning. The orc was skilled but inexperienced, otherwise he would have moved in for the kill. He knew that he had to end the fight soon, before the blackness of unconsciousness took him. Driving in valiantly, he led with his shield, the Eye of Odin thrusting up under the orc's own. He plunged his longsword inward in a movement so practiced that it was second nature. His sword point found the gap between the orc's chainmail shirt and his unprotected armpit. Then it found his heart. The orc didn't cry out in pain, and neither was he aware of what had so quickly stolen his life as he fell. Thus ended the adventures of the orc called Nail. When Nail fell, a terrible fury came upon the orc with but one great tooth. Leander knew that he now faced a berserk, an even more dangerous opponent. Now Tooth would feel no pain until the end of battle, and his strength would be twofold. Hoping that Dartin would assist him, he retreated, trying to parry the orc's savage blows. But when he looked askance, he saw that his friend lay atop of his fallen enemy as if mortally wounded. Perhaps the orc had traded deadly blows with him. Alone now, he changed tactics. Moving back into the cover of the trees, he used them as shields against the orc's savagery, like a rabbit evading a wolf. If he had to be the rabbit, then he would do so with the clear head of a trained fighter. Leaping over fallen branches and brambles, he dodged behind tree trunks, bushes, and boulders. The orc pursued him ferociously, never giving up an inch of ground. He hoped that the beast would tire, but his strength seemed without end. All that he could hope for now was luck. But with or without luck, the orc's rage had its own limitations, and in his relentless chase, he failed to notice a tangle of roots at the base of a fine maple tree. Catching his toe in the tree's treacherous roots, he fell headlong and lost his grip on his sword. He tried to rise immediately, but he hadn't fallen well, and he suddenly realized the peril of his rage. Leander wasted no time in contemplating the orc's misfortune. Launching himself behind his fallen enemy, he drove his sword downward in a double-handed grip that passed through the orc's body and into the ground beneath him. The orc struggled for a few moments and then lay still. No more would they fight, tooth and nail. Kurr met the first of his enemies with his stout sword. The lead orc wielded a great curved scimitar preferred by his kind, and Kurr's sword met only his upraised shield. But this didn't diminish Kurr's ferocity or his confidence, for he was a direct descendant of Baldric, father of the mountain dwarves. Baldric was the first dwarf created by Mordeus, the Soul Forger. Crafted with fire at the center of the world, his body was made from mithril, iron, and stone. The spirit of Baldric flowed strongly in Kurr's veins, and if he listened to his heart, he could still hear his song. He could feel his legacy. Kurr's people had long ago learned how to combat larger opponents, and he had been trained in such techniques from an early age. He knew how best to face multiple opponents, and thus he knew how to face two. The orcs circled him, trying to attack him from two sides, but he skillfully worked them in counter-circle, allowing them to attack him only one at a time. His own weapons beat outward in a titanic 1-2. He never allowed himself to fall into a repetitive pattern, lest his foes find a weakness in his attack. Despite his best efforts, however, the orc's weapons met his body several times, but never did they find a stationary mark, and his anvil had mail held against them all. He had fought in countless battles against the jackals, and in no few against men and some Lael Selfar of unsavory character. It was because of this that he was never daunted by his opponent's size. He had survived for so long because he had learned how to study his enemies in battle. He knew how to find their weaknesses and quickly capitalize on that knowledge. He had an uncanny ability to lead his foes into making some fatal mistake. In this manner, he studied his new orcan enemies, noticing the manner of their fighting style. In the span of a few exchanged blows, he was able to formulate a plan of attack. Feigning weakness as the orcs' weapons drew closer to their marks, he emphasized it with many wails of pain and desperation. His own broken rhythm became a repetitive one, and soon he saw the gleam of anticipation in his enemies' animal eyes. They were certain of their own superior strength. They were confident and very eager. The gleam in their eyes was the gleam in his eyes was very, very different. Staggering back in mock fatigue, he allowed the orcs to encircle him. He lowered his weapons slightly, as if his dwarven arms could bear their weight no longer. He was the perfect image of weakness and vulnerability. He would be an easy kill. Grip and Chomp saw their chance for glory. Their victim was too weak to resist. It was almost too easy. Their war masters had told them of the great strength of their dwarven enemies and the incredible toughness of their small bodies, but this dwarf seemed so weak and puny. Perhaps he was a weak example of his kind, but it made no difference to them as long as they were the ones who made the kill. The dwarf's beard would bring them great honor among the tribes. They would have their choice of the females, and the children would ask them for stories of the hunt. It didn't matter how easily the beard was won, for the tale of battle would grow in the telling. They would be heroes. They saw their future glory. They would finish him. Signaling to each other, they struck in unison, their blades arching down upon the defenseless little dwarf. But Kurr wasn't tired, nor were his arms too weak to maintain their grip on axe and sword. In fact, he had never felt quite as strong in all his life. He could see the reflection of the orc behind him in the eyes of his forward enemy. Using this tactic, he developed eyes in the back of his head, and he was more than ready when the orcs decided to strike. At the last possible moment, he rolled backward, coming to his feet in a low fighter stance. The orcs' blades met nothing but air. They were off balance and caught by surprise. Stepping behind the lead orc, Kurr hamstrung him with two mighty chops from his axe and sword. Grip couldn't stop his forward momentum in time, and he fell headlong over his companion's tumbling form and into Kurr's waiting blades. He dispatched them quickly, each strike designed to kill. He was a warrior and worthy of his beard, but although he had a love of battle, he had no love for killing. He was Kurr Kegporter, son of Moldrin and Isa, and a direct descendant of Baldric, father of the dwarves. Okay, we're going to Now we can make it through this. Let's call it a night. Last call for wine and ale, Jack announced. Best be wrapping it up or I'm charging you all for rent. He was joking with us, of course, but it was growing quite late. Indeed, I had told our tale in as fine of a fashion as I ever had. I wasn't sure if I'd felt a stronger need to teach these men a little history, or if I owed it to my friends to tell the true story of our lives. Whichever was true didn't really matter, as long as my friends who'd sacrificed so much were remembered with honor. I had told my story many times in all of the years that I'd come to Jack's, and although the story had grown, it had grown only in detail. The kind of detail that develops with the vivid memories cultivated by old minds. And I was indeed old, even for a gnome, and the night's storytelling would soon have to end. I wasn't about to escape so easily, however, for although my listeners were young and naive, they were very perceptive, and they sensed that my storytelling was coming to a close. "You're not going to stop now," Polly said. "You can't just leave us hanging like this." "At least tell us if they survived the battle," Eric said. "We ride out tomorrow morning, and will not be back until our next leave." "What about Tariq?" Garrett said. "That orc really had him pinned down." "All right," I said, "all right. I'll finish telling you the tale of their great fight against Urg and his war party. I can see that I've gone too far to hold back now." And I was just about to begin when a tall, snow-covered figure came into the bar. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, he wore a dark fur-lined cloak, treated with oil to keep out the snow. The dull sheen of his high black boots could be seen beneath the hem of his cloak, and he carried himself in a manner that I would have recognized were he standing among 1,000 similarly dressed men. There was a strong presence about him, even in his old age, and those who found themselves near to him felt the need to lower their eyes as a token of respect. His face was serious, with a strong jaw, sharp eyes and brows turned gray. Surveying the bar, he shook out his cloak and hung it upon One Eye's brass coat rack. Removing his gloves, he passed his hands over his face and brushed back his shoulder-length hair so that it fell behind his hellfire ears. Standing before the bar and its oil lanterns, the ever-watchful eye of Odin could be seen embroidered upon his black tunic. It was my old friend, who traveled here in the dead of winter from far-off Khan. He must have come on a matter of great importance, though what it might be I could only guess. "Is that?" Eric said. "I mean, it can't be." "Your story's not really real," Garrett said. "I mean, all of those things didn't really happen, did they?" "Indeed," I said. "Here is my lifelong friend Dartin, and you must all judge for yourselves whether my story is true." And while I was trying to calm the boys down, Dartin, warrior priest of Odin, was asking Jack for his own tankard of ale. Grasping it in both hands, he turned and approached us. He knew where I was, although the tavern was only dimly lit. He would have found me even if he'd been blind. "It's a fine night for a warm fire and fond friendship," he greeted. "Surely there could be none finer," I answered. "But what brings you here from so far and in such weather as this?" "There's plenty of time for that later. But for now, I hear that you have a tale to tell." "Yes, please tell us." Sonia agreed. And that's where we'll end episode 23 here. We'll end episode 23 here at the bottom of page 249. And Dartin, warrior priest of Odin, also was one of my good friends, a man named Robert Jackman. Inspired and played Dartin in many of my Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. All right. And if we recall, we'll go back, pay a little tribute to Joe Garside. Unfortunately, Joe passed away. He's the inspiration for Tariq Longstride. He was a tremendous gamer, an incredible game master, dungeon master, and that's his precious dog Loki. He was a great friend. Miss him. Okay, thank you. Have a great night, and remember, as always, read Kurrs Rage, Part 1 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga, and all of the following novels. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed it. Have a great night.